Beverly Wivell was just 23 years old in the autumn of 1989, living an ordinary life in Washtenaw County, Michigan. On a quiet September evening, she set out, unaware that this night would mark the end of her story and the beginning of a decades-long mystery. Beverly wasn't the kind of young woman who simply disappeared. She was close to her family, responsible, and deeply connected to those who loved her. So when she failed to return home, alarm bells rang instantly. Hours turned into a day, and by the time police were alerted, her absence was already a chilling signal that something had gone terribly wrong. The search began with urgency. Flyers were distributed, neighborhoods canvassed, and loved ones interviewed. Detectives worked tirelessly, but the landscape of 1989 crime-solving was limited. No advanced DNA tools, no national databases, just old-fashioned investigative grit. And as each lead dried up, the shadows around Beverly's disappearance grew darker. Her family was devastated. Birthdays passed in silence, holidays left an empty chair at the table, and each passing year, without answers, carved deeper wounds into their lives. Beverly had vanished, and no matter how hard authorities searched, there was no closure, no explanation, no justice. But what no one could have imagined was that this case, frozen in time, would one day be cracked open. Not by a sudden witness, not by a confession, but by the unstoppable march of technology. And nearly 36 years later, the silence surrounding Beverly's death would finally be shattered. When Beverly Wivell was first reported missing in September 1989, investigators in Washtenaw County threw every resource they had into the search. Officers retraced her last known steps, scoured the rural roads, and spoke with friends, family, and neighbors. They looked for any sign, any clue that could explain her sudden disappearance. Days later, the search took a devastating turn. Beverly's body was discovered. She had been murdered. The horror of the crime shook her family and community to their core. What was supposed to be an ordinary autumn day had transformed into a lifelong nightmare. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened. They collected evidence, interviewed possible witnesses, and examined every lead. But despite their efforts, the trail kept collapsing. The forensic tools of the late 1980s were primitive compared to today. DNA testing was in its infancy, databases were limited, and investigative technology could not deliver the answers her family desperately needed. Suspects were considered, but without definitive proof, charges never came. As months turned into years, the investigations slowed. Witness memories faded, evidence sat in storage, and frustration built. For Beverly's family, the silence was unbearable. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a loved one, and the person responsible was still walking free. Holidays became reminders of her absence. Every September marked another year without answers. They were forced to live in a cruel limbo, knowing Beverly was gone, but never knowing why. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, her case officially went cold. The file sat in storage, another haunting entry in the long list of unsolved murders. For many, hope dimmed. It seemed that Beverly's story, like too many others, would fade into the shadows of forgotten justice. But time has a way of changing everything, and hidden within the evidence collected back in 1989 was something investigators didn't yet realize: the key to breaking this case wide open. For more than 3 decades, the name Beverly Wivell rested in the silence of a cold case file, her family left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. But in recent years, technology has done what time alone could not. It has given a voice back to the voiceless. By the 2020s, DNA forensics and genetic genealogy had revolutionized the way police approached unsolved murders. Evidence that once seemed insignificant, tiny traces, invisible to the naked eye, now carried the potential to identify killers even decades later. Washtenaw County detectives, refusing to let Beverly's case fade, turned back to the evidence preserved since 1989. It was painstaking work. Every fragment of biological material was re-examined using technology unimaginable in the late 80s. And then came the moment investigators had been waiting for. A viable DNA profile emerged. With it, they could run comparisons across state and national databases, and even tap into genealogical mapping that had cracked other notorious cold cases. The results pointed to a man whose name had not been tied publicly to Beverly's case before, a suspect who had lived freely for more than 30 years. After careful review, police built their case and prepared to act. In early 2025, authorities announced a stunning development. A suspect had been formally charged with Beverly Wivell's murder. After decades of silence, her story had finally moved forward. For her family, the breakthrough was both a moment of relief and a flood of new pain. The arrest did not bring Beverly back, but it proved something powerful. She had not been forgotten. The killer had not escaped. The fight for justice had not ended with the closing of a file. This was not just an arrest. It was a reminder that even after 36 years, the truth can still rise from the shadows. When the news broke in February 2025 that a man had been charged with the 1989 murder of Beverly Wivell, shockwaves rippled through Washtenaw County. For nearly 36 years, the case had been a haunting mystery. Now the possibility of justice was real. The suspect, a man in his 60s, was led into custody, older, grayer, and seemingly ordinary to those who saw him that day. Yet behind the facade was the chilling accusation that he had carried Beverly's blood on his hands for decades while living his life freely. To the community, the arrest was both surreal and sobering, a reminder that killers don't always vanish. They often blend into the everyday world, hiding in plain sight. Inside the courthouse, emotions ran high. Beverly's surviving relatives, some now elderly themselves, sat quietly as the charges were read aloud. For them, this was more than a legal proceeding. It was the first real chance to hear her name spoken in a court of law, not as a victim in a forgotten cold case, but as the center of a fight for justice. Prosecutors laid out their evidence, grounded heavily in modern DNA testing that tied the suspect to Beverly's murder. What was once impossible in 1989 had now become the foundation of their case. The defense, as expected, began to question the reliability of decades-old evidence, attempting to sow doubt about the chain of custody and the interpretation of forensic results. It was clear this would not be a simple trial. The courtroom would become a battlefield of science, memory, and morality. But for Beverly's family, just seeing someone held accountable after all these years felt like a victory in itself. Reporters crowded the steps outside the courthouse, covering every update, every motion, every reaction. For the first time in decades, Beverly's story was back in the headlines, not as a mystery, but as a pursuit of justice. And as the trial loomed closer, one truth hung in the air. After 36 years of silence, Beverly Wivell's voice was finally being heard again. For 36 years, the name Beverly Wivell lingered in silence, a life taken, a family shattered, and a community left with questions that no one could answer. Her parents died without knowing the truth, carrying their grief to the grave. But those who remained never stopped hoping, never stopped praying that someday, somehow, Beverly's story would find justice. Now, in 2025, with a suspect finally in custody, that long wait has begun to find resolution. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring Beverly back, but it proves something powerful. No matter how much time has passed, justice can still find its way. For her surviving family, the moment is bittersweet. They have fought through decades of birthdays missed, holidays haunted by an empty chair, and the cruel silence of an unsolved crime. Seeing someone finally held accountable is a victory, but it's also a reminder of everything that was lost. Beverly should have grown old, built a future, lived a full life. Instead, her memory has been frozen in time since 1989. What stands out most in this story is not just the crime, but the perseverance. Detectives who refused to close the file, family members who never stopped speaking her name, advances in science that gave a voice to evidence long ignored. Together, these forces broke open a case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Beverly's story is no longer just a cold case. It's proof that persistence matters. It's a message to families of victims everywhere. Never give up, because even after decades, the truth can rise to the surface. Beverly Wivell's life was stolen, but her story has now been told. Justice, though delayed, is finally within reach, and that is something her killer can never take away. If this story touched you, help keep Beverly's memory alive. Like this video, share it with others, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. What do you think about cases like this being solved decades later? Your engagement helps these stories stay alive, ensures victims are never forgotten, and brings awareness to other unsolved mysteries still waiting for justice. Because Beverly deserved so much more, and by remembering her, we honor every victim still waiting for their truth.